There was once a young boy named Daniel. He was 12 years old, and he lived in a very small town with his grandmother. Daniel was not rich. He had no fancy clothes, no computer, and no mobile phone. His house was tiny, made of wood and old bricks. But even though his life was simple, Daniel had one special gift. He loved listening to stories. Every evening, when the sun went down, Daniel would sit outside on the wooden steps of his house. His grandmother, who had silver hair and soft, kind eyes, would tell him stories about her life. She spoke about how she grew up in the countryside, how she worked hard on the farm, and how she dreamed of traveling the world. Daniel would listen carefully, his eyes wide with wonder. But more than anything, Daniel dreamed of something else. He dreamed of learning English. For him, English was not just a subject at school. It was a magical language that could open doors to new places, new friends, and new adventures. He imagined himself reading books from other countries, watching movies without subtitles, and maybe one day, speaking to people from faraway lands. Still, there was a problem. Daniel was shy. Whenever the teacher asked him to read aloud in class, his voice would tremble. The words would feel heavy on his tongue, and the other children would sometimes laugh. That made Daniel even more afraid to speak. He thought, maybe I am not smart enough. Maybe English is too hard for me. But deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Don't give up." One afternoon, Daniel was walking home from school when he passed by the town library. It was a quiet place with tall windows and old wooden shelves. Normally, Daniel just walked past it. But on that day, something caught his eye. There was a colorful poster on the wall. It showed a group of smiling children holding books, and the words on it said, "Learn English through Story Free Reading Club for Beginners." Daniel stopped. He read the words again and again. His heart beat faster. A club, a reading club, for beginners like him. He felt nervous. What if he was the worst student there? What if the others laughed at his mistakes? But then he remembered his grandmother's advice. Courage is not the absence of fear, Daniel. It is doing the right thing, even when you feel afraid. So that evening, after finishing his chores, Daniel walked to the library. When he pushed open the heavy wooden door, the smell of old books filled the air. There were maybe 10 children sitting in a small circle, and in the middle sat a tall man with glasses. He had a warm smile and spoke in a clear voice. "Welcome, everyone," the man said. "My name is Mr. Thomas. Today, we begin our journey of learning English through stories." Daniel sat down quietly, his hands shaking a little. Mr. Thomas held up a simple book. The cover showed a picture of a young girl and a red bicycle. "This is a story," he said, "about dreams, courage, and friendship. We will read it together, slowly, and we will understand it step by step." The children began to read, one by one. Some read quickly, others slowly. When it was Daniel's turn, his hands grew cold. He could feel sweat on his forehead. But he remembered his grandmother's words again. He opened his mouth and read the sentence carefully. His voice was quiet at first, but as he continued, it grew stronger. Mr. Thomas smiled at him and said, "Excellent, Daniel. Very good effort. Remember, mistakes are not failures. Mistakes are steps to success." Daniel felt a small spark of confidence inside him. For the first time, he realized something important. Learning English was not about being perfect. It was about practicing trying and not giving up. From that day forward, Daniel went to the library every week. The stories they read were simple, but each story carried a lesson. One was about a bird who wanted to fly higher than the clouds. Another was about a farmer who worked hard and never gave up, even when his crops failed. Each story was short, easy to understand, and full of meaning. Daniel began to notice changes in himself. His vocabulary grew. His pronunciation improved. But more than that, his courage grew. He started answering questions in school. He started practicing English words when he bought bread from the shop. Sometimes people laughed at him, but he no longer felt ashamed. Instead, he laughed with them and kept practicing. One evening, as Daniel walked home from the library, he looked up at the sky. The stars were shining brightly. He thought about the stories he had read, and he whispered to himself, "If I can learn one new word every day, if I can read one more story every week, then maybe one day I will be able to speak English fluently." He smiled. His journey had just begun. But Daniel's story was not only about English. It was also about courage, friendship, and dreams. He didn't know it yet, but his small steps would soon lead him to something much bigger. Because sometimes, the smallest decisions, like walking into a library, can change your entire life. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel became one of the most regular students at the reading club. Every Thursday evening, he would hurry through his chores, grab his notebook, and rush to the library. He always sat in the same chair, near the corner, but his confidence grew each time he read aloud. The other children started to notice. "Daniel, you read much better now," one girl said with a smile. Another boy added, "You sound braver than before." Daniel blushed but felt proud. He was no longer the shy boy who trembled at every word. One day, Mr. Thomas announced something exciting. "Next month," he said, "our reading club will have a small performance. Each student will choose a story, practice it, and then present it in front of parents and guests. It will be a chance to show your progress and to share the joy of learning English through stories." The room buzzed with excitement. But Daniel felt nervous again. Speaking in front of the class was one thing. Speaking in front of parents and strangers, that was terrifying. His hands grew cold just thinking about it. That night, Daniel sat with his grandmother and told her about the performance. She listened carefully, then touched his shoulder gently. "Daniel, remember when you were afraid to read aloud in class? And then you faced your fear and grew stronger? This is just another step. Fear is like a wall, but every time you climb it, you become taller." Her words gave him courage, but the nervous feeling stayed. Still, Daniel decided to try. He chose a simple story about a fisherman and his net. The story was short, but it carried a big lesson: patience and persistence bring rewards. Every evening after school, Daniel practiced. He stood in front of the mirror, just as his grandmother once told him stories. He repeated the sentences slowly, carefully, listening to his own voice. At first, his voice wavered. But little by little, it grew steadier. He practiced not just the words, but also the emotions. How the fisherman felt when he caught nothing, how he almost gave up, and how he finally succeeded. The day of the performance arrived. The library was decorated with balloons and colorful banners. Parents, siblings, and friends filled the chairs. Daniel's grandmother sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. When his turn came, Daniel walked to the small stage. His legs shook. His heart raced. But when he saw his grandmother smiling at him, he felt a wave of calm. He opened his mouth and began to read. The first words were quiet, but then he remembered Mr. Thomas's advice. Speak as if you are telling the story to someone you love. Daniel lifted his head, looked at the audience, and spoke louder. His voice grew stronger with every line. He described the fisherman, the empty net, the long night, and finally the moment of success. When he finished, there was a short silence, then a round of applause. Daniel felt his cheeks burn, but his heart soared. He had done it. He had spoken English in front of everyone, and they had listened. His grandmother wiped a tear from her eye, clapping with joy. That night, after the performance, Mr. Thomas came to Daniel and said, "Do you see, Daniel? You are not only learning English, you are learning courage, discipline, and confidence. These are lessons that will stay with you forever." Daniel nodded. For the first time, he truly believed he could do more than he ever imagined. The next weeks brought even more change. Daniel began writing small notes in English. He labeled things in his house: door, chair, table, window. He even started keeping a small diary where he wrote a few sentences each night. Today I went to school. I learned a new word, hope. One afternoon, while Daniel was walking home, he saw a group of tourists in the town square. They looked lost, holding a map and speaking in English. Daniel felt nervous, but then he remembered the stories, the performance, and his practice. He walked up to them shyly and asked, "Can I help you?" The tourists smiled with relief. "Yes, please," one of them said. "We are looking for the old church." Daniel's heart raced, but he pointed and said slowly, "Go straight, then turn left. The church is near the river." The tourists thanked him warmly. Daniel walked away, his chest full of pride. He had just spoken English to real foreigners, and they had understood him. That evening, he told his grandmother, and she hugged him tightly. "Do you see, Daniel? The world is opening to you." But Daniel's journey was not only about learning English. It was also about discovering himself. He realized that stories were not just words on paper. They were bridges that connected him to other people, to other cultures, and to his own courage. One rainy night, Daniel sat by the window, listening to the sound of raindrops. He opened a storybook from the library and began to read. The story was about a little bird who was afraid to fly. The bird stayed in its nest, watching the sky, dreaming of freedom. But one day, the bird spread its wings and discovered the joy of flying. As Daniel read, he smiled. He felt that he was just like that bird. For a long time, he had been afraid. But little, by reading stories, by speaking out loud, by facing his fears, he was beginning to fly. He whispered to himself, "I will keep learning. I will not stop. One day I will be fluent. One day I will tell my own story." Spring arrived in Daniel's town, and with it came new energy. The fields turned green, flowers blossomed, and the streets felt alive again. Daniel also felt a new kind of growth inside himself. His English had improved, but more importantly, his confidence had blossomed. One day, Mr. Thomas entered the reading club with exciting news. Children, he said, a nearby city is hosting a storytelling festival. It is a place where people from different towns come together to share stories in English. I want some of you to join and represent our library. The children gasped with excitement. A festival. In the city. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to go, but he also felt nervous. Would his English be good enough? Would people laugh at his mistakes? But Mr. Thomas looked directly at him and said, Daniel, you have a gift. You do not only read stories, you bring them to life. I want you to join. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Deep inside, he knew this was his chance. In the weeks that followed, Daniel prepared with dedication. He chose a story he loved. The tale of a boy who planted a single seed and waited patiently for it to grow into a tree. The story symbolized hope, patience, and faith in small beginnings. Every night Daniel practiced, just as he had done before. But this time, he added his own touches. He used gestures with his hands. He changed his tone of voice for different characters, and he even practiced pausing to create suspense. When the day of the festival arrived, Daniel and his grandmother traveled to the city. It was the first time Daniel had ever left his small town. The tall buildings, busy streets, and bright lights made him feel both excited and overwhelmed. But his grandmother held his hand and whispered, Remember, Daniel, you are ready. The festival hall was large, with rows of chairs and a stage lit by spotlights. Children from many towns were there, some with polished clothes, some with strong voices. Daniel felt small among them. But then he remembered the fisherman's story, the tourists he had helped, the applause in the library. He took a deep breath and reminded himself, I belong here too. When his turn came, Daniel walked onto the stage. His heart pounded, but he stood tall. He opened his book, but then he decided to close it. He didn't need the words on paper anymore. He knew the story by heart. He began to speak slowly, carefully, but with feeling. He described the boy, the seed, the long days of waiting, the moments of doubt. He used his hands to show the tiny seed and then stretched them out to show the tall tree. He looked at the audience, making eye contact, letting them feel the emotions of the story. For a moment, Daniel forgot about his fear. He forgot about mistakes. He was simply telling a story, sharing it with people who wanted to listen. When he finished, the hall was quiet for a second, then filled with applause. Daniel's grandmother clapped the loudest, tears rolling down her cheeks. Mr. Thomas smiled proudly, and Daniel felt something he had never felt before. He felt like a storyteller, not just a learner. That night, back in the small guest room where they stayed, Daniel looked at his grandmother and said, I want to keep going. I want to keep learning, reading, and telling stories. I don't just want to learn English. I want to live it. His grandmother hugged him and whispered, Daniel, this is only the beginning. In the months that followed, Daniel's world expanded. He borrowed more books from the library. He wrote his own short stories in English. Simple ones at first, but each one better than the last. Sometimes he even read them aloud to the younger children in his town. They listened with wide eyes, just as he had once listened to his grandmother. And slowly, Daniel realized something important. English was not just a subject. It was not just about grammar, words, or tests. It was a bridge to dreams, to people, to confidence, and to new worlds. Years later, people in the town would still talk about the boy who once walked shyly into the library, afraid to read a single sentence. They would talk about how that same boy stood on a stage and spoke with courage. They would talk about Daniel, the boy who learned English through stories, and who taught everyone that learning is not about being perfect, but about never giving up. And Daniel himself would remember one lesson above all: dreams are like seeds. If you water them every day with courage, patience, and practice, they will grow into trees stronger than you ever imagined.